There's a certain type of person everyone knows, even if no one quite knows how to describe them. They're present, warm, insightful, sometimes deeply engaging, and then they vanish. Weeks turn into months. Messages go unanswered. Calls go unreturned. And when they eventually resurface, it's rarely dramatic. No apology tour, no explanation long enough to satisfy curiosity. Just a quiet reappearance, as if nothing unusual happened at all. They're often labeled dismissively. Ghosts. Flaky. Emotionally unavailable. Avoidant. But those labels flatten something far more complex. People who disappear for months are not driven by carelessness or cruelty. Psychologically, their withdrawal is almost always purposeful, even if unconscious. And in many cases, it's not about other people at all. It's about how they experience themselves, connection, and emotional saturation. To understand the ghost personality, you have to stop viewing disappearance as rejection. For many of these individuals, disappearing is regulation. People who vanish for long periods often have an internal world that runs hot. Thoughts loop, emotions linger, experiences imprint deeply. While others process externally, by talking, venting, sharing in real time, ghost personalities process internally. They digest life slowly, and that digestion requires space, silence, distance. Connection for them is not neutral. It's stimulating. Meaningful conversations don't energize them indefinitely. They drain them. Even positive interaction leaves residue, not because it was bad, but because it mattered. So when life accumulates, work pressure, emotional complexity, social obligations, the nervous system reaches a threshold. And when that threshold is crossed, withdrawal becomes the only way to restore equilibrium. This is the first key truth. Disappearing is not avoidance of people. It's retreat from overload. Another defining trait of ghost personalities is how they experience continuity. Most people experience relationships as ongoing threads. Even during silence, the connection feels intact. Ghost personalities experience relationships episodically. When they are present, they are fully present. When they are absent, the connection goes quiet internally too. This doesn't mean they forget people. It means relationships don't stay on in the background. Out of sight often becomes out of active emotional mind, not out of lack of care, but out of how their attention system works. When they disappear, it often feels final to others. To them, it feels temporary, even necessary. This mismatch creates misunderstanding. Another psychological layer is emotional autonomy. Ghost personalities often guard their inner world fiercely. They don't like being observed while processing. They don't want to explain half-formed thoughts or raw emotions. Disappearing gives them privacy to recalibrate without external input. In many cases, this pattern was learned early. People who grew up needing to self-regulate emotionally without reliable external support learned to retreat inward when overwhelmed. That retreat worked. It kept things manageable. And so it became the default response to intensity. Over time, withdrawal turned into a personality pattern. Another important factor is identity fluidity. Ghost personalities often go through internal phases, periods of growth, collapse, reinvention, reflection. During these phases, they don't want to be seen, not out of shame, but because they don't yet recognize themselves. Reappearing only when they feel coherent again feels safer than staying connected while uncertain. This is why their disappearances often coincide with life transitions. Burnout, loss, identity shifts, emotional overload. They don't announce these changes. They go silent and deal with them alone. Silence is their workshop. There is also a strong connection between ghosting and emotional honesty. Many ghost personalities would rather disappear than show up half-present. They don't want to offer shallow responses, forced enthusiasm, or performative check-ins. If they can't show up authentically, they prefer not to show up at all. From the outside, this looks like neglect. From the inside, it feels like integrity. Another misunderstood aspect is guilt. Contrary to popular belief, many ghost personalities feel intense guilt about disappearing. They think about the people they haven't replied to. They replay conversations. They plan responses in their heads. But guilt doesn't motivate reconnection. It often freezes it. The longer the silence, the heavier the return feels. What do I say now? It's been too long. I'll explain later. Later stretches. Another layer is time perception. For ghost personalities, time collapses inward. Weeks pass quickly when they're internal. What feels like a short while to them registers as abandonment to others. This mismatch isn't intentional. It's neurological. They don't disappear to punish. They disappear to survive. Ghost personalities are often highly sensitive to expectations, even unspoken ones. A message creates an obligation. A reply creates momentum. Momentum creates responsibility. And responsibility requires energy they may not have, so they opt out entirely. This is especially true when multiple relationships demand simultaneous presence. Ghost personalities don't multitask emotionally well. They go deep or they go quiet. There's rarely a middle ground. Another key trait is that these individuals often don't experience loneliness the way others do. They can feel connected to people without contact. Memories, internal representations, and imagined conversations maintain a sense of bond. So silence doesn't register as rupture internally, but externally, it does. This asymmetry is where most relational pain occurs. Understanding the psychology of people who disappear for months requires abandoning moral judgments and looking at nervous system strategy. Withdrawal is not inherently unhealthy. It becomes harmful only when it's rigid and uncommunicated. And many ghost personalities don't communicate because they don't fully understand what they're doing themselves. They just know they need to disappear. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, it's important to hear this without shame. Disappearing doesn't mean you're broken, manipulative, or uncaring. It means your system manages overwhelm through absence. Staying connected to explanations like this matters, because without them, ghost personalities internalize labels that don't fit. And staying subscribed isn't about excusing harm, it's about understanding patterns so they can become flexible instead of fixed. This is only the beginning of the picture. There are deeper layers still. How ghost personalities form, how they experience attachment, how relationships feel from the inside, and why reconnection is often harder than disappearance. To really understand the ghost personality, you have to look at how these individuals experience attachment. On the surface, many of them appear avoidant. They disappear. They go silent. They don't maintain regular contact. But psychologically, their attachment style is often misunderstood. It's not that they don't form bonds, it's that bonds live differently inside them. For ghost personalities, attachment does not require constant reinforcement. Once a connection is established, it becomes internalized. The person exists as an inner presence rather than a continuous external interaction. This means that emotional closeness doesn't fade just because communication stops. The bond remains intact internally, even during long silences. This is one of the most confusing aspects for others. While friends or partners feel abandoned, the ghost personality often feels quietly connected, assuming the relationship is on pause, not broken. This difference in attachment processing creates relational asymmetry. One person measures connection by contact, the other measures it by internal continuity. Neither is wrong, but when unspoken, the mismatch causes pain. Another deep psychological layer is emotional saturation. Ghost personalities tend to absorb emotional experiences fully. A single conversation can stay with them for days. A conflict can echo internally for weeks. They replay, analyze, reflect, integrate. While others discharge emotion through conversation, ghosts metabolize it internally. This means that even positive relationships can become overwhelming if there's too much emotional input without recovery time. Disappearing is not about rejecting connection. It's about letting the emotional residue settle. Silence is their processing chamber. This is why ghost personalities often reappear calmer, clearer, and more grounded. The disappearance served its purpose. But because that purpose is internal and invisible, others only see the absence, not the regulation happening underneath. Another key factor is self-concept fragility during stress. When ghost personalities feel overwhelmed, their sense of self often becomes unstable. They don't feel like a coherent version of themselves. In that state, interacting with others feels exposing. They don't want to present a fragmented self. They want to wait until they feel whole again. This is why explanations are rare when they return. They didn't disappear because of one event. They disappeared because they weren't ready to be seen. There's also a strong relationship between ghosting and emotional honesty. Ghost personalities often have an all-or-nothing approach to presence. If they can't show up authentically, they prefer not to show up at all. Half-presence feels dishonest. Small talk feels performative. Checking in without capacity feels false. So instead of offering shallow engagement, they withdraw entirely. From the outside, this looks extreme. From the inside, it feels principled. Another overlooked dimension is shame. Many ghost personalities carry a deep fear of disappointing others. They know their disappearance hurts people. They know it causes confusion. And that awareness generates shame. But shame does not motivate reconnection. It immobilizes it. The longer they're gone, the heavier the return feels. I've already failed. They'll be angry. I don't know how to explain. So they wait until the shame quiets enough to reappear. Time perception plays a critical role here. Ghost personalities often experience time subjectively. When they're internal, time compresses. Days blur. Weeks vanish. What feels like a short retreat internally becomes a long absence externally. This isn't negligence, it's absorption. Another factor is that ghost personalities often have weak external scaffolding. They rely heavily on internal regulation rather than routines, schedules, or social structures to anchor them. When overwhelmed, those internal systems take precedence over external obligations. Social maintenance falls away. This is also why many ghost personalities struggle with consistent habits of communication, even when they genuinely want to improve. The withdrawal is not a conscious choice each time. It's an automatic nervous system response to overload. Another important psychological trait is selective depth. Ghost personalities tend to go deep with a few people, not wide with many. When those few relationships become emotionally complex or demanding, there is nowhere else to distribute emotional load. Withdrawal becomes the only option. They don't ghost because they don't value connection. They ghost because connection is heavy. There is also a strong correlation between ghost personalities and creativity, introspection, and high inner complexity. These individuals often have rich internal landscapes. Ideas, emotions, narratives, and meanings are constantly being constructed inside them. External interaction interrupts that process. During intense internal phases, the outer world fades. This isn't escapism, it's immersion. Another aspect is control. Disappearing gives ghost personalities a sense of agency when life feels chaotic. They may not be able to control circumstances, outcomes, or emotions, but they can control access to themselves. Silence becomes sovereignty. For people who have felt overwhelmed by others' needs or expectations in the past, this control feels essential. Another misunderstood point is that ghost personalities are rarely impulsive in relationships. They don't attach lightly. They don't engage superficially. When they connect, they mean it. That's precisely why they retreat when overwhelmed. They don't want to damage what they care about by showing up resentful, depleted, or inauthentic. They'd rather disappear than rupture. Unfortunately, disappearance can itself feel like rupture to others. This is where relational damage accumulates. not from malice, but from misalignment. Understanding the ghost personality also requires addressing the myth that constant communication equals emotional maturity. For some people, maturity looks like regular check-ins, immediate replies, and steady presence. For ghost personalities, maturity looks like knowing when to retreat to avoid emotional harm. Both are strategies. Neither is inherently superior. The problem arises when one strategy is treated as moral and the other as defective. Many ghost personalities internalize harsh labels over time. I'm unreliable. I'm bad at relationships. I hurt people. These narratives increase shame and make future disappearances more likely. Shame fuels withdrawal. Understanding softens it. If you are someone who disappears for months, it's important to understand that your nervous system learned this pattern for a reason. At some point, withdrawal protected you. It gave you space when nothing else did. It allowed you to survive emotional overload. The work is not to eliminate disappearance entirely. It's to make it communicable and flexible. Healthy withdrawal includes signaling, even minimal signaling. I need time. I'm going quiet for a bit. This preserves connection without requiring presence. But signaling requires self-awareness and trust. Two things ghost personalities are often still developing. Another layer is that ghost personalities often don't realize how permanent silence feels to others. Because silence feels neutral or restorative internally, they assume it feels the same externally. This gap in perspective is not selfishness. It's difference. Bridging that gap requires reflection, not shame. Ghost personalities also tend to return when their internal state stabilizes, when they feel more like themselves, when coherence returns. That reappearance is often genuine. They're not pretending nothing happened because they don't care. They're doing it because the disappearance feels resolved internally, but externally, it's unresolved. This mismatch can create cycles of reconnection and rupture. Another important psychological truth is that ghost personalities are often deeply loyal. Even during absence, they think about the people they love. They replay conversations. They hold others in mind. Loyalty doesn't require contact for them, but relationships do. And this is where growth happens. Growth for ghost personalities is learning that presence doesn't have to be constant, but it does have to be predictable, that people can tolerate absence better when it's named. That disappearance without explanation creates stories that are often harsher than the truth. And growth for those in relationship with ghost personalities is understanding that silence is not always rejection. Sometimes it's survival. Neither side is wrong. They're speaking different nervous system languages. Understanding the psychology of people who disappear for months reframes the behavior entirely. It's not cruelty. It's not indifference. It's not manipulation. It's a complex strategy for managing intensity, autonomy, and inner life. But like all strategies, it has limits. Disappearing works until it damages trust. Silence regulates until it isolates. The goal is not to force ghost personalities to become constantly available. The goal is to help them find ways to retreat without vanishing completely, to rest without erasing themselves from others' lives. And that begins with understanding. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, know this: you are not broken. You adapted intelligently to emotional overload. Now, you're being invited to evolve that adaptation into something more relationally sustainable. And if you're listening because you've been ghosted, understanding this doesn't erase the hurt, but it gives it context. It helps separate intent from impact. Staying connected to insights like this matters because ghost personalities are often misunderstood and mislabeled. Subscribing isn't about excusing harm, it's about replacing simplistic narratives with psychological truth. People who disappear for months are not empty. They are full, often too full. They don't vanish because they don't care. They vanish because caring takes everything they have. And once that is understood, the word ghost loses its meaning. They were never gone. They were regrouping.